Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Laugesen, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars, in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Please subscribe to our Substack at Present Danger China and follow us on X at CPD China. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is the president of the Institute for the American Future at usfuture.org, vice chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China, and host of Securing America on Real America's Voice Network.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of our weekly webinar series. This one will address a topic of both great importance and considerable controversy. I say that even though there has been an extraordinary degree of unanimity exhibited on both sides of the aisle in all three branches of our government in the past year or so. The issue is TikTok, a social media app best known for its, silly dance videos, among other things. It is prodigiously popular with the American people. By some estimates, 173 million or so of us are not only subscribers to this app, we're addicted to it. And therein lies part of the story that we will be telling in the course of this very important conversation. I mentioned that this is controversial because in addition to having a wide audience for short videos on various subjects, some of which are of commercial value to Americans and others, the TikTok app has some features that are, to put it bluntly, weapons aimed at the heart of the United States of America by the people who really run the operation. It's not a company known as ByteDance. It's the Chinese Communist Party. The idea that the United States government would, to this point, have allowed a technology, a social media platform that has these kinds of weaponized qualities, which we will explore at some length, to have become something to which 173 million, or whatever the number is, of us are addicted, is simply gobsmacking. And when you learn more about it, you'll realize that the Congress of the United States, that by an overwhelming bipartisan majority in both houses, adopted legislation requiring ByteDance to divest, to disassociate itself, to sell off TikTok. That the president of the United States at the time, Joe Biden, a Democrat, of course, but acting on a policy recommendation of his predecessor, Donald J. Trump, 45th president of the United States at the time, and that the entirety of the United States Supreme Court would endorse essentially the ban on TikTok by upholding its constitutionality. It is remarkable that we find ourselves with any controversy at all, let alone a significant one. But that is because President Donald J. Trump, now the 47th president of the United States, has announced his intention to have the Department of Justice decline to enforce this statute, despite oaths of office requiring faithful upholding of the law, pursuant to an idea that the president has announced that he would take, I think it's 90 days, to try to find some workaround, presumably involving a different ownership arrangement, but to be determined. We're going to explore what all of this means, what it means particularly for the national security of the United States, but also to the half of its population that are enthralled with TikTok, what it means to the Chinese Communist Party in terms of its unrestricted warfare against this country, and quite possibly the shooting kind it may engage in shortly. And not least, what it will mean if this emerges as something of a constitutional crisis, which the law is not being upheld and enforced by the new president of the United States and his Justice Department. I can't tell you how pleased I am that we have an all-star cast to discuss the various dimensions of this subject. We will begin with a very familiar face, one of our Committee on the Present Danger China members. His name is Charles Sam Faddis. His most important qualification for doing all of this analysis and commenting and, deep diving into what TikTok is about is that he spent 20 years or so of his professional life working on the dark side, the clandestine services of the intelligence agency, specifically the Central Intelligence Agency. He knows a lot about suborning and recruiting and compromising and otherwise manipulating people, because that was part of his day job. And we've asked him to sort of level set for us, provide the situational awareness about what TikTok represents that we so urgently need. These days, he is the editor of a terrific online resource and magazine, substack.com. I commend it to you, as well as his pre-recorded remarks, which we'll go to now.
You know, when we start talking about TikTok, I have a significant amount of sympathy for the folks who are very reluctant to sign on to the fact that we should ban this app from the United States, because we have gone through such a period of time with government censorship and government efforts to control what we can see, what we can say. I mean, I have personally been banned from social media outlets. God knows how many times Facebook has fact-checked, in air quotes, something I've written. You know, I'm with a lifetime of experience in weapons of mass destruction. I'm writing something about weapons of mass destruction, and Facebook, in its august wisdom, is explaining to me that I'm wrong and I'm not allowed to say that. So I get it. I understand that people are really apprehensive, but I think what they do not understand is the true nature of what we're talking about with TikTok, its design, its intent, its purpose. First of all, just as bedrock, we just need to accept the fact that we are talking about something that is, in effect, run by the Chinese Communist Party. It is a creation of the Communist Chinese. It's under their control. TikTok is not a free entity. Its existence is dependent upon the Chinese Communist Party, and it's really used for whatever purposes the Chinese Communist Party wants it to be used for. So you're not dealing with the marketplace of ideas, free speech. You're dealing with something that is, in effect, a propaganda outlet for a hostile totalitarian regime. There's a lot of discussion about how TikTok can be used to influence people, spread disinformation, and push communist ideology. And I think sometimes that gets short shrift because it kind of starts to smell like yeah, okay, buddy, that's crazy talk. Come on there. And by the way, it's not a particularly serious medium, this kind of stuff. It just sort of gets dismissed. Okay, TikTok has actually an incredibly massive reach, particularly with younger Americans. And I get it that I've reached the age where virtually everybody's a younger American to me. But the point is, if you're talking young adults, teenagers, even folks in their 30s, a huge number of them, it turns out, when you look at surveys that have been done in actual serious research, a huge number of them are getting most of their news off of this thing. And its reach is unbelievable. It's something like half of Americans at least have the app. So this is a massive mechanism for a hostile Chinese communist government to pump news, in air quotes, directly into the populace. That's not a minor thing. That's a huge deal. I mean, all these legacy networks and so forth that many of us are focused on as news outlets pale in comparison to what's coming out of TikTok, and it's just sort of injected directly into the veins of younger Americans, if you will. So there's that whole issue. But then another aspect of this that I think just doesn't get nearly as much attention would be the technical nature of TikTok. By this I mean what it mechanically does, if that's the right term, and how the Chinese can use the information it obtains. When you put this thing onto your phone, it doesn't sit there, the software doesn't sit there and just passively wait for you to use it and then only do what you're telling it to do. I mean, for lack of a better non-technical way to describe this. This thing infects your device and it begins to do all kinds of stuff. You look at studies that show that, you know, if you're using Facebook does all kinds of intrusive things too that I'm not okay with and don't think it should be doing. I mean, harvesting data and kind of ranging around on your computer or whatever. But the extent to which TikTok does that is like something like 4 or 5 times greater infection, for lack of a better way to do that. And it does all kinds of stuff that has no legitimate purpose for what it's supposed to be doing. Like it literally logs and records every key you punch. So and I don't mean just on TikTok, I mean on your phone. So all of your emails and all your text messages and all of this information. And when I say it's logging that and recording it, obviously it's storing that. In other words, everything that TikTok's doing on your phone gets sucked out of your phone, and then it ends up on a server, and they have all of this information. Again, with an app that's ranging around and extending itself and doing all kinds of stuff on your phone. So that's not just a privacy issue, right? I mean, you just stop and think about that for a second. It's not just hey, I don't really think the Chinese need to record every message that I'm sending back and forth with my wife or members of my family or my business messages for that matter. I certainly don't think they need to store all that. But then the question is, why do they do that? I mean, you don't put an app onto millions and millions and millions and millions of phones that ranges around and intrudes itself into all sorts of functions and sucks up all this data just because you can, or just for giggles. I mean, you want that information for a reason. What is that reason? What are you doing with all of that information that you took off my phone? And it is not telling you, by the way, that it's doing this. Now, so as has been stated by folks much more technically proficient than I, this is spyware. This is the kind of stuff that an intelligence service would put onto your phone to spy on you and steal information without letting you know. Well, that's exactly what it's doing. Okay, why? Now, juxtapose that with things like the FBI director saying, Ray, before he stepped down, that we are facing an absolutely unprecedented threat from the communist Chinese when it comes to their cyber attacks, how they dedicate more resources to attacking us than every other country on the planet combined, that they have penetrated all of our critical infrastructure. They're prepared to turn off the lights, turn off the water, crash the banking system, take down the stock exchange. And he's not saying they have aspirations to do it. He's saying they can do it. They are prepositioned, and it is clear that they intend to do this in conjunction with a political and or military confrontation. Okay, well, when you're hacking into systems and getting passwords and figuring out all the things you need to penetrate systems and get past security, what do you need? Personal data. Dates of birth and names and your pets' names and where you're going and all those messages you sent where you were dumb enough to put your password in it or your PIN code in it. Okay, well, that's what TikTok hands them. So, I get it that people are very nervous about this idea about banning any kind of anything connected to speech. I understand that. This is not free speech. This is an attack by a hostile communist regime, and 100% TikTok needs to go.
Thank you. Sam Battis, as always, you have boxed the compass, as they say, handsomely, providing, I think, serious grounds for concern about this instrument of intelligence collection as well as indoctrination. Our next speaker is going to take this set of concerns to a higher level in the sense of what it says about Chinese intentions as well as capabilities, that they have this kind of political warfare instrument, information warfare instrument, if you will, at their disposal, and the implications for this in a strategic environment in which the Chinese Communist Party makes no secret of its intent to destroy us. And we have no comparable capability, let alone an even more powerful one, to wield against the Chinese in support of their people and their opposition to the regime that threatens both them and us. That speaker would be Dr. John Lenczowski, the Honorable John Lenczowski, by dint of the work that he did for our mutual boss, Ronald Reagan. Back when men were men, he was the director for European and Soviet affairs in the Reagan National Security Council, also a special advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs for a time, part of a very distinguished record of service to our country, which has continued in his post-government life as an educator. He founded and has run for many years, first as its president, now as its chancellor, an absolutely stupendously important institution of higher learning, the Institute of World Politics. He's been a dear personal friend of mine, as well as a very valued colleague of all of ours, a member of our Committee on the Present Danger China, the author of a number of important books, including one that is of particular relevance to today's topic, and that would be one entitled Full Spectrum Diplomacy and Grand Strategy. And we are delighted to have him with us in person and to have a chance to talk with him both, to hear from him his own remarks and to engage in some Q&A with one of our other speakers. Dr. Lenczowski, welcome back. It's good to have you with us, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Frank. It is great to be with you and with your distinguished guests. And I am delighted to participate in this particular session. I would like to stress that the Chinese Communist Party, based on a long tradition dating back to the 2,500 years to the days of Sun Tzu, the author of The Art of War, prizes engaging in forms of warfare that are not always kinetic. In fact, Sun Tzu wrote in his book that the acme of skill is to defeat your enemy without having to use force. The Chinese communist regime is using this technique of warfare against us and has been doing so now for decades. And of course, another lesson of Sun Tzu is that deception is the essence of warfare. And so what we're seeing here in the use of this particular instrument, TikTok, is a method, as Sam said, of perceptions, of propaganda. It's a form of perceptions management. It is designed to pollute the information environment in order to confuse people about what is actual ground truth, what are international realities. It's designed to convey disinformation, which is slightly different from propaganda. Propaganda uses the truth where it serves the CCP's purposes, and then it uses lies and it mixes the two together. And even if people know that they're listening to some propaganda, the goal of the propagandist is to get the audience to say, this can't be all lies. And once somebody comes to that conclusion, the CCP, the propagandist, has succeeded in defining the terms of debate, defining the lens through which the audience sees reality, and distorting it in the interest of the propagandist. And this is what happens on TikTok. There is a large part of this involves strategic deception. Strategic deception is where you try to disguise what your actual nature is. What is your DNA? What are your strategic intentions and purposes? It is, I tell my students, my graduate students, that there are two kinds of animals in the forest. There are carnivores and there are herbivores. And the carnivores eat the herbivores because it's in their nature to do so. But some of the cleverest of them attempt to get the herbivores to believe that they are herbivores too. And so a huge part of Chinese political warfare strategy has been to deceive the West, and particularly Americans, into believing that they are just a normal state, a normal country. They ceased to be communist a long time ago, that they don't have plans for global domination. They don't have plans to transform us into a tributary state. And the result is psychological disarmament. And this is what has happened to huge segments of American elites who have bought in to the idea that communist China changed and they aren't a threat anymore. Well, as a result of COVID and the China Wuhan virus, we've begun to wake up to the fact that China is not honest in its dealings with us or the rest of the world. But nevertheless, TikTok is used as a method of co-optation of segments of the U.S. population, and to get many of them, of course, because many people have business interests that they exploit using TikTok as a vehicle, and co-opting them in effect to supporting the overall mission of TikTok. Now, TikTok is also involved in what one could call subversion, and it has been it attempts to discredit the American system, discredit American democracy. It has supported a lot the way many front organizations of Chinese intelligence have done, organizations like Black Lives Matter. And in the particular case of TikTok, it was distributing videos to people in this country who the TikTok executives believed were likely to riot in favor of Black Lives Matter and the Antifa agenda. And TikTok distributed instructions on how to riot. And because they had so much good information that they had collected through their data collection, as Sam described, they were able to target likely rioters and give them professional advice on how to do maximum damage while keeping themselves essentially safe from being arrested. So all of this has been designed to undermine our society and to assist the effectiveness of political violence in this country. Another thing that TikTok also does is it has promoted pornography amongst young people, and it does so in a very strategic fashion. It starts out exposing even young teenagers to soft pornography, and then once they detect that somebody is getting addicted to it, they guide them down a path towards ever greater extremism and perversion in the pornography. And it is just amazing to me that our government permits pornography to exist at all in this country on free speech grounds. It is such a damaging thing to our society. It destroys marriages. It gets people to objectify others, treat them as objects rather than as persons, and it gets them to it even destroys the sex lives of otherwise perfectly healthy people. But be that as it may, that's our own internal problem. But the CCP is exploiting it. And then finally, I should mention that TikTok also promotes the glorification of drug use amongst teenagers, which is extremely, China has a long record of narcotics warfare. It exports fentanyl to this country. It has no scruples or compunctions about killing Americans doing this. And TikTok is one of the ways that they help soften up that battlefield in the narcotics war. So anyway, it is a remarkable weapon of subversion, of political and information warfare. And the amazing thing about it is, of course, as you raised it, Frank, at the very beginning of this session, China would never let us, the Communist Chinese would never let us have anything similar within China. And of course, we, in our foreign policy establishment, has long abandoned any kind of serious consideration of a policy of reciprocity in dealing with adversaries. When during the Cold War, we permitted more KGB agents to work in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow than there were Americans working in that embassy. And of course, The Soviets never permitted us to have a single American working in their embassy here in Washington. It was a joke, but this kind of a joke pertains across the board in all sorts of aspects of our foreign policy. And here it is again with the TikTok case.
John, thank you so much. I look forward to a further conversation with you in the Q&A about a passion that you have had since you worked for President Reagan, and that is getting information into nations like, in that case, the Soviet Union, or in this case, China. And what a benefit it would be if we were to have something akin to TikTok. And it makes all the more, I think, outrageous that we find ourselves in the situation where we've tolerated the weaponization of this app inside our country and not raised a peep, as far as I can tell, about the need for us to have similar opportunities to speak directly to the Chinese people, even if we weren't interested in actively subverting their government, which we should be. That would seem to me to be something we should be demanding. We're going to turn next to a man, again, no stranger to these programs, another member of our Committee on the Present Danger China, who has devoted himself both in his role as a retired colonel in the United States Marine Corps, as well as a Foreign Service officer, as well as a businessman and now a commentator in various platforms, as well as an author, about the kind of warfare that China has been waging against us and what may be coming next. His name is Colonel Grant Newsom, as I say, United States Marine Corps retired. He is the author of a very timely book entitled When China Attacks, a Warning to America. Colonel Newsom has been very much alert to the problems that this kind of weapon in the hands of a country that he believes it's just a matter of time before it acts violently against us, namely communist China, can use TikTok as a means of specifically attacking, subverting, and otherwise neutralizing our military. We were able to conduct an interview with him. He was unfortunately unable to be with us in person on this occasion, but in our Securing America program for this evening, we had a chance to talk with him a bit about what is the military threat we face from TikTok. And I commend it to you. We'll go to an excerpt of that interview at this point.
You think about a military force, and you think about how you have to indoctrinate it. You have to train people to think a certain way, and you have to train them to certainly think that you're the right side, and that we are a decent force, a decent country, and we're here to defend it and to sacrifice our lives if necessary. And this is the indoctrination which takes place to everyone in a military, takes place with new recruits in particular, and also you're trying to get people to join the military. And this is a psychological business, and you're trying to shape the way people think. So we have to do that to our own people. And that's hard enough. It is fortunately we're the United States, and we still have most people who love the country. But think about this with TikTok, and we are allowing the enemy to indoctrinate our military, the active duty, the recruits, and the people who might join. It's about that simple. And in World War II, it's worth remembering, there was Radio Berlin and Radio Tokyo, so Tokyo Rose, and I think Lord Haw for the Germans. And they would put out propaganda and regular radio broadcasts, and it was all kind of laughable, and nobody took it all that seriously. They might listen for the music, but it wasn't very effective. Well, now you have an enemy, and the Chinese call us the main enemy, so it's not like we're picking a fight. And they have the ability to access the minds of all of our troops, the recruits, and people who want to join in. And TikTok is really effective. You can either subtly or not so subtly manipulate the way people think. You just have to manipulate them a little bit to make a military much less effective. And you can broadcast 24/7, and you've got them addicted. People weren't addicted to Radio Berlin or Radio Tokyo. They are addicted to TikTok. And everyone thinks they're too smart to be affected, be influenced, but I wouldn't bet on it at all. So we are allowing this to happen. And something else I'd point out is we're all talking about TikTok. When the Indians got into a fight with the Chinese up on their northern border about 4 years ago, immediately afterwards, the Indians banned TikTok. They took them about 3 days to do it. But at the same time, they banned over 50 other Chinese apps. And so you could get rid of TikTok, and you're going to have a whole bunch of other apps that are doing just the same thing. So this is really a case where the United States and its leadership have gone insane to allow this to continue. But you're also seeing, I think, a lot of Americans selling out. When you saw TikTok's CEO, remember, testifying last year before Congress, you knew he was going to lie. But behind him was this phalanx of his lawyers and lobbyists, of Americans, who sold out for Chinese money. And it is about that simple. And they are doing their best to make sure that that an administration cannot protect its citizens, and that the military cannot protect its troops, its soldiers, from the really enemy propaganda and enemy really psychological manipulation. This goes beyond propaganda. This is cognitive warfare of the worst sort, and unfortunately, the Chinese are pretty good at it. But you've got plenty of Americans who will sell out their country, and you can see it on display almost every day with these people defending TikTok from all parts of American government and society.
That's terrific, Grant. I think we could wrap it there, but let me just ask you one further question, because I think it goes to the operational piece of this. If, in fact, as you have warned in your book, when China attacks, we find ourselves in a shooting war with the Chinese Communist Party, presumably this instrument would be available to them to actually encourage the people they've manipulated, they've induced to sell out, or at least, feel their country isn't the right side, as you put it, perhaps to engage in acts of subversion or other kinds of means of, undermining our own nation. And look no further than what they did to engage people to support Hamas on college campuses all across the country a year or so ago. What are your thoughts about that from the perspective of, again, a seasoned military veteran?
Well, it's about as bad as you can imagine. And you don't have to, get everyone in the military to think a certain way, to think the way the Chinese want. You just have to get enough of them and enough the right positions. And we've seen remember the intelligence leaks that we suffered over the last 20 years, generally by these junior enlisted, who were affected, who were somehow influenced to think the U.S. was the wrong side. So you've just got to get enough people to think that. And once again, you can use it to create discontent on the home front, where people are opposed to the war. You have the anti-war protesters, the people who think the Americans are the wrong side. And you're going to have those anyway, even if there wasn't TikTok. But TikTok makes it even worse. And this is about as bad as you can imagine. Sometimes we used to complain about that spy balloon that flew over the U.S. A couple of years ago. But with TikTok and with all the apps you've got on your iPhone in your pocket, you've got basically a spy balloon in your pocket. So from just an intelligence and information security perspective, this is insane. And it brings to mind a comment that a young Marine major sent to me from Afghanistan. And he said, "Sir, sometimes I think we want to lose." And it is about that simple. And I am just baffled by the U.S. government response to this. The fact that it has taken this long to defend ourselves is troubling, to say the least. And it does raise some real doubts about how serious we are about taking on the People's Republic of China.
Thank you, Colonel Grant Newsom. As always, a very clear-eyed assessment, informed by a lot of hard experience, both in uniform and in the business of diplomacy and, well, for that matter, the business of business out in East Asia. We're going to conclude these prepared remarks or informal remarks with one of our favorite journalists. It's a pretty small group, I have to say, but he stands up among them, head and shoulders above the rest. His name is Jan Jekielek. He is a senior editor with a terrific newspaper, the Epoch Times. There's the current legal print edition talking about the Trump executive orders and the new presidency. They do a marvelous job. He is also the host of a production of Epoch Times and I believe NTD, it's a video arm, called American Thought Leaders. I think many of our guests have had the privilege of being on it. I have myself on occasion. It's a superb program, one of the best of its kind, and that is a function of Jan's long-time experience in the business of journalism and academia. He's an award-winning documentary filmmaker to boot, and a very important contributor to our programs. We're always delighted to have him with us to talk about a topic that he specifically proposed. It's kind of tantalizing, and I'm anxious to hear what he has to say on the matter. It is, quote, "Don't count out Donald Trump on TikTok," unquote. Jan, it's great to have you with us. Welcome. The floor is yours, sir.
Frank, thanks so much. That's a pleasure, and I mean a true honor to be here among some of these, real intellectual giants. Colonel Newsom's book is a must-read. I want to kind of endorse it here on not just this cognitive warfare that he described, but also on the kinetic aspect. Sam Faddis talking about, both these intelligence, the deep intelligence connection side of things. The CCP has a interest in having a digital profile of every American. Why? Because it can be used in warfare, especially this kind of cognitive warfare. So, TikTok is the prime collection method for 170 million odd Americans of that. And then the ability, I believe that Sam said it incredibly well, the ability to inject propaganda directly into the veins of those people. Actually, I hadn't thought of it quite that way, but I think that's actually very apt. And of course, John Lenchowski, now that I believe John is still the chancellor, if I'm not mistaken, certainly a president emeritus of the Institute of World Politics, probably the premier school of diplomacy in America, if not the world. So I'm amazed to be here. I think what John's comments were particularly interesting because there's this whole element of strategic deception. It seems to those of us on this call that it's very obvious that the Chinese, under the Chinese Communist Party, are constantly engaged in strategic deception. In fact, every communication of theirs, I would argue, has an element of strategic deception. And I hadn't really thought about how that manifests, particularly in the context of TikTok. But I guess masquerading as an innocent app that, frankly, contributes to the livelihoods of millions of Americans now. That's an incredibly powerful way to insinuate yourself into a society. So, and insinuate yourself so strongly that, in fact, the president of the United States is grateful for being able to have used the TikTok app to win this election, which is, I believe, what happened. The president was asked in the Oval about, about TikTok, and he indicated that he has this may have been in another response, but a warm spot for it because he's used it and it's been effective, and of course that makes a ton of sense. However, we've just heard all the reasons, and they're plentiful, including, as Frank, you mentioned, the Supreme Court identified it's not a free speech issue. And I mean, we have some of the many of the jurists on the Supreme Court have a profound understanding of that issue of free speech, and they decided no, this isn't the question. So let me talk about what I think might be going on, and we'll have to see. I could be wrong about this, right? I'm just thinking about what President Trump did back in 2018. And he did a couple of things back in 2018, come to think of it, that maybe are illustrative. President Trump likes to have very warm relationships with people who are authoritarian leaders, right? And this is something he's actually been criticized quite a bit for this. In fact, there's been, Chinese dissidents that have spoken to me and said, why is the president so warm to Xi Jinping, for example, or Vladimir Putin? And, I would often tell them, okay, that's fine. I mean, he's also known to be a deal maker, right? And generally, if you want to try to make a deal with someone, you need to be able to have a decent relationship with them. It's incredibly helpful. But also look at what else he did, right? So in the case of China, I would argue that in 2018, with the Section 301 tariffs that Trump imposed, serially, that was probably the first action that actually forced the Chinese regime into a position that it didn't want in highly significant action of this nature in decades. And I don't know, I could be wrong. And the people on this chat are happy to correct me. I'd be very happy to be corrected by them here, because you certainly would know this better than I. But the Chinese regime doesn't believe in win-win. They don't. You have to kind of leverage them into the position that is a win for you. And that was the first time I'd seen really that happen in an incredibly long time in a very meaningful way. So on the one hand, there was all sorts of warmth towards Xi Jinping. On the other hand, incredibly consequential a policy that indicated a strong approach in requiring the Chinese to comply to America's needs. Another example, this one also, I believe in 2018, Wagner Group, what we could describe as the little, Russian little green men, make their foray into Syria, right? And what happens? Well, it's sort of a gray zone activity. We're not very good at dealing with gray zone activity. Actually, Colonel Newsham explains this quite robustly in his book as to how we're kind of impotent in responding to that. But what did Trump do? Well, Trump just blew them up, and that was the way that he sent the message to Vladimir Putin to not do that anymore. And there were no more incursions after that. It wasn't a discussion. The discussion had been had. I'm going to test you, and the response will come back. So I think we're in a situation like this. This is, if I was going to predict, and I think this is one of these situations. I think the president is, weighing his options. This 50-50 solution, which I've heard about, I can't really imagine how that would exactly work, because I don't think the U.S. can really accept any situation where the Chinese regime controls that TikTok infrastructure in any way. Right. I don't think that's as has been discussed here extensively. I just don't think that's a possibility. And I think the president having full access to the classified information, never mind the unclassified information, but also the classified information about what TikTok is doing, I'm sure will be well aware of this. So I think he's basically feeling out what is what the opportunity is, right? He's all of these plays. I just had Joe Humeyer on the show talking about the Panama Canal and these, discussions about, taking back the Panama Canal. The real context of that was, of course, that China controls the Panama Canal in a very meaningful way, and that's just unacceptable to America. So really, that's what's happening here. And already, Joe actually predicted in a way prior to the president starting to sign executive orders and let's say influencing the Panamanian government. They're actually running an audit on Hutchison now, right? And that's we'll find some very interesting things if that audit is thorough and in good faith. And it's, I think, kind of exactly what the president would have wanted. He didn't ask for an audit. He said other things, right? So to me, of course, I could be wrong. That's quite possible. But I've never known the president to be, blind to the hard realities of dictatorships as much as he's been accused of that. I kind of seen quite the opposite. So I'm happy to be proven wrong. I wouldn't be happy to be proven wrong, but I'm happy to be corrected by my extremely esteemed panelists here.
Well, thank you, Jan. You set up the conversation very nicely for the Trump element of this. And I think all of us are feeling our way along here. I don't think you need to be particularly self-conscious about not being certain of your assessments, but I think they're informed and they are eliminating, at least in terms of what is uncertain about all this, and therefore what we need to probe more carefully. I wanted to start, if I could, by just going sort of through what I call a thought experiment, distill down what's been said and some things that I think still need to be teased out in terms of the capabilities TikTok represents for the Chinese Communist Party. I would approach this from the point of view of how would they feel if we could do the following to them. To, for example, reach directly to half of the population of China. In their case, it's larger than our population considerably, but whatever the number is, to have Americans be able to communicate in an unfiltered, uncensored way directly with large numbers of Chinese is sort of point one. Point two, something that several of you have touched on, the idea that we would be able to essentially hook up those Chinese that would be subscribing to this service that we might have in this highly addictive fashion. I've seen statistics, and I don't know whether to credit them or not, but something on the order of studies that say it took 32 minutes on average for someone watching what was being served up by TikTok with an algorithm calculating what were their particular preferences for it to become absolutely irresistible, highly addictive. And something Sam touched on. How about if what we were providing to the half of the Chinese population, something in the way of news and information services that they rely upon, especially if we had the opportunity to use it to disseminate propaganda insinuated into some of the other information, either overtly or subliminally, perhaps, for purposes like undermining, as I said a moment ago, the Chinese Communist Party and extolling America and its values. And then not least, but last for this purpose, what about having access to all of our personal information? And I think several of our speakers have tease that out a little bit, but just think of what's on your personal cell phone. Your communications, your personal data, perhaps a lot of your health information, your passwords, and not least your phone's camera and microphone, which can be used to obtain information about everybody with whom you interact. In short, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's safe to say the Chinese would have none of this if we had this kind of capability. Would they have gone to war, a shooting kind of war, to prevent it? I think that's a not unreasonable conclusion. And they must be astonished that we have done so little to this point to resist what they've done, and the success that they've had mobilizing some portion of their 173 million subscribers, and most especially the one who, as Jan just mentioned, did make use of TikTok to secure the presidency in this most recent election cycle. So I guess the question that I would put to both of those of you who are with us in person at this juncture is this. There's nothing reciprocal about this arrangement, let alone something that we exclusively enjoy. Should that not be the bare minimum, a starting point on what is to be done about TikTok? If we don't have similar access, if we don't have similar opportunities, that it's clearly the case. It must not operate here. And any comments about, the arrangements under which even then it could be allowed to operate? Certainly not the 50-50 partnership. But your thoughts as to both reciprocity and how this thing could be structured that would not give rise to pretty much the same concerns we have right now. John, should we start with you?
Oh, I would love that. You're right. I mean, basically, the Chinese regime holds the keys to everything and only strategically allows those pieces that are in its own advantage, right? This is actually, if I want to mention just one quick thing, I saw a really interesting X post from our friends over at China Uncensored, which is a fantastic show, basically a comic treatment of the realities of communist China multiple times a week. I'd highly recommend viewing that. They make this very interesting point, which is just simply that somehow TikTok, as a propaganda tool, has convinced a whole lot of Americans that it's actually the U.S. government that's kind of bad in preventing giving them access to this incredible tool, and that somehow the Chinese government is kind of neutral at worst or something like that. If not, with some of these young people whose videos I've been seeing, sort of moved from TikTok, waxing about how much better it is in China, how much they've learned from these, the people they're talking to over on Redbook, this, very ironically named Chinese app, which is of course also run by the Chinese regime. So that just as a curiosity, it's a kind of case in point, if I may, again. If you want to know how TikTok can manipulate people, look at these young people who are saying all this on TikTok videos, right? That people have been posting on X, and it's astonishing to see. But obviously, they've been manipulated into that. Frank, this is what. Now I'll get to your question. I don't like the idea of manipulating people personally. Okay, we live in a society, and we've lived in a society like this perhaps since the times of Edward Bernays when he wrote Propaganda, that where it's actually considered to be acceptable, morally acceptable, to go out and manipulate people. Our advertisers do it all the time to us to get us to buy products and so forth. I would argue that it's not moral to manipulate people, right? Whether it's at a individual scale or mass scale. Convince people is different than manipulate, right? Because you're doing it subtly. You're doing it in a hidden way. You're playing on the things that people aren't clear on, parts of their psyche that they're not being clear or being manipulated very actively. So I don't think we should treat it that way. I'm not a fan of the propaganda approach in that sense, the manipulation approach. What I am, and I think if you want to create, instant, incredible reciprocity with the Chinese regime, is tear down that great firewall of China. Okay, tear it down. The crazy thing is, we actually have the tools to do this stuff. At Epoch Times, we use multiple technologies. I think the most effective ones are FreeGate and UltraSurf. We use them because they work and the uptime is 100%. Basically, and they're fantastic tools. The only thing that constrains them is the actual the ability to open up those holes in the firewall, which is, it has to do with money, because it's always a cat and mouse game. You open up one hole. I could go into the details of how the technology works in a broad way another time, but you have to open up a hole, and then the regime closes it and you open up another one. But if you threw enough money at it, and it's not actually that huge an amount, you could actually open up pretty huge swaths of the internet, and not just with you would probably use multiple technologies at once. But that, give the Chinese people the opportunity to just see the stuff that they want to see, right? Understand the world is different. Someone who had just come from communist China recently was reminding me that most people in China don't believe that Tiananmen Square massacre even happened. They've been that successful, since 1989, and basically making it a non-issue. The younger generation thinks it's just some weird, American propaganda to demonize China. That's just one example. But in a propagandized society, you don't know what you don't know. And wide open access, I think, could be an amazing, amazing policy decision for this incoming administration, which would, kind of transform the U.S.-China relationship. And I might also add that I think it's also one of the, if I say, nicest ways to approach it, because hey, these are our values, right? Our values are free speech, and we believe that Chinese people deserve the ability to have unfettered access to information, just like Americans do. We're not fighting you here, and in a sense, I think that's actually very right. And let Chinese people decide for themselves on the legitimacy of the regime that under which this boot they are.
Fascinating. Yeah, thank you. John Lachowski, one of the things that I've admired about you from back in the Reagan days is your both personal familiarity with and deep appreciation of these kinds of instruments of public diplomacy, if you wish, or information warfare, and the role that I guess, in a way, the closest that we have ever had to something like TikTok was Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe back in the Soviet era. We were communicating directly to the people of the captive nations and the Soviet Union. We were bringing them information that was highly subversive to the regime. The difference, I would argue, of course, and I think you would too, is that what we were telling them was the truth, as opposed to some lie that we were trying to manipulate them into believing. Could you talk about that experience and how it should inform the kinds of thinking we need to do about TikTok's disposition, but also the sorts of things that Jan was just discussing in terms of our capabilities?
During the Cold War, all sorts of dissidents testified, coming out of the communist world, testified to the power of our international broadcasters, which were the only methods of getting unfiltered information into the population of those countries which were denied a free press. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian author, for example, called the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty the most powerful weapon the West possessed in the Cold War. I repeat, he called it the most powerful weapon we possessed. And this is not nuclear weapons, not navies, et cetera, et cetera. While all those things are important, but he called our broadcasters the most powerful weapon. Why? Because life under communism is living under a complete avalanche of lies. This is how the regime keeps itself in power, by maintaining an ideological party line, enforced by its monopoly of information and communication. And they force people to repeat the official falsehoods as a sign of either loyalty or submission to the regime. They atomize the society. They make it so that nobody can trust anybody else in the society, because nobody knows who is a secret informant to the secret police. And so people are isolated from each other. They can't trust each other because of this atmosphere of fear. Therefore, they cannot share information openly, easily with each other, and they cannot organize in cells of resistance to the totalitarian tyranny. And so by sending in those broadcasts, we were giving the populations of the captive nations the truth in the face of official lies. We gave them their history back, and totalitarian regimes revise the history of their own nations in order to remake the national memory, in order to reshape the national identity, in order to create submissive new communist men, the new man. In the Soviet Union, it was the new Soviet man. And then we gave them things that they were denied. We gave different religious faiths, religious programming. We gave them alternative ideas, democratic ideas, the ideas of the consent of the governed. And so these communist regimes, including the Chinese regime, the North Korean regime, etc., the central fact of political life in those regimes is the party's fear of their own people. And so they have these massive internal security systems, and the nucleus of those internal security systems is not simply the secret police, it is that monopoly of communication and information. When we could get good signals into some of these countries, as we did, for example, to Poland, people would learn about civil disturbances like the strike at the Lenin shipyards in Gdansk. And they would learn about these while the strike was happening. Normally, what happens when there's a civil disturbance in a totalitarian regime is the regime first cuts off all communications to the locality of the disturbance, and only then goes and physically crushes the riot, the demonstration, or the strike. But if people learn about this, it's not just the truth that needs to be gotten to people, it's the instantaneity of that information, which can help millions of people join in solidarity, as the Polish public did when they learned about the strikes before the regime could do anything about it. So there's so many different aspects of this. And the radios, the broadcasts also help to break down the atomization. I love the story about the guy who got on a bus in Warsaw, a commuter bus in the mid-50s, started whistling a song that he heard over Radio Free Europe, couldn't hear that song on the local communist stations. And then other people started gradually whistling along with him. And pretty soon the whole bus of these quiet, sullen commuters started whistling the same song. And they all looked at each other and they knew they were secret listeners to a subversive radio station, listening to it at pain of punishment. And this broke down atomization. And so it isn't just information that we can get. It's even such a thing as music, for goodness sake, that can make a difference in helping to build resistance to these regimes. There's no way on God's green earth that the Chinese communist regime would ever break down the Great Firewall or stop the jamming of the few broadcasts that we're doing. We need to do a lot more to communicate with the Chinese people.
John, that's exactly where I was going to go next. If I could just stay with you, the idea that we don't have anything remotely on par with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, to say nothing of something as powerful as TikTok, is astonishing. Truly, but in terms of the priorities as you see them for us to be competing in this battle space, to be, doing all of the things you just described with and for the Chinese people, how would you prioritize these kinds of actions? And does stopping TikTok feature as a necessary part of that agenda?
I think we need to develop an integrated strategy of multimedia communication with the Chinese people. Yes, shortwave broadcasts, which is one way that you can get a message in there, are jammed. They're jammed particularly in the high-density population areas, but they can't be effectively jammed all the time in the countryside and the exurbs where 1 billion people live. And so we need to massively ramp up the degree to which we are getting broadcast signals, and whether they come from terrestrial transmitters or whether we can get them in through satellites, whatever we need to be doing, television broadcasting, we need to have effective methods on the internet. We need to have a Manhattan Project like project, as Jan was just suggesting, to break down the Great Firewall. This would be huge. And all the monies that we're talking about here are incredibly small in national strategic terms, and yet they are the one form of offensive strategy that the United States can undertake that will put Beijing on the defensive for the first time. We have no offensive strategy at all, and it is in this realm, this gray zone realm of information warfare, psychological strategy, international communications, that we can do this. It's nonviolent. It's a nonviolent method of conflict that brings an element of reciprocity into the Cold War with China. In the Reagan administration, we got $2.5 billion to modernize and strengthen the signals of the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty. And in today's dollars, that is $8.3 billion, okay? $8.3 billion in today's dollars is what we did in the Reagan administration. And today, the entire U.S. Agency for Global Media, which includes the VOA, the Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Marti, the Middle East Broadcast Network, etc. All of that is simply $1 billion budget. And it is peanuts. It's peanuts in national strategic terms. So this is one place where we need to have a major strategic investment, and where the foreign policy establishment of this country and the Secretary of State have to start paying serious attention to this entire dimension of foreign policy, which is constantly neglected by everybody in Washington in our materialistic foreign policy culture, where the only thing that seems to command any attention are guns, rockets, and boxes of cash, and the diplomacy concerning them. And so this is a whole different dimension of foreign policy. It's in the gray zone, and gray zone activities are something that, Washington just doesn't want to even think about.
Well, John, this is one of the things that I very much hope as the new administration gets its feet on the ground, it will take advantage of your extraordinary corporate memory on all of this and hard-won experiences as well. Jan, we're a little over time. I just did want to ask you one more question. Speaking of boxes of cash, which prompted a chuckle from you. A feature of this, as I think I said at the outset, and several of you have alluded to, is the extent to which what the Chinese describe as elite capture has enabled them to essentially get away with stuff like TikTok and that image that I think it was Grant Newsham talked about, the CEO of TikTok, who was testifying and predictably lying as he did about having nothing to do with China, and that China has nothing to do with TikTok, and it's not using it for any of the nefarious reasons or purposes that we're talking about. A man who, by the way, was invited by Donald Trump to be at his inauguration. I mean, not just at the inauguration, but inside the Capitol with him. This individual has a lot of friends behind him, a lot of old friends, as the Chinese call them. You and the Epoch Times have done some terrific work examining this phenomenon and the role that it plays, as John said just at the very end of his comments there, in ignoring an obvious threat, in fact, enabling it. In addition to your idea of taking down the firewall, what are your thoughts about correcting this problem of the captured elites of our country playing for the other team?
Frank, thank you for this. Well, so my view on this side, of course, elite capture is a massive, massive problem, both in Canada, my home country, and in the U.S. More so, I think, even in Canada.
Soon to be a State of the Union. Stay tuned.
Yeah, we could for another episode, right?
It's another day's work. Yeah.
So to me, the most pernicious aspect of this elite capture in America, and I think our mutual friend Roger Robinson would agree with this, or would argue this probably, is actually it's the place where America funds the regime's activities, right? And there's of course individual examples of elite capture and things like that, but I think the most profound place, right, is that because we still have to this day, foreign direct investment has, I think, been zeroed out for a whole bunch of reasons. This passive investment, which is, sort of big funds picking up Chinese companies on the exchanges and so forth, is still going strong, even as, the bond market in China is failing, which is just like beyond any semblance of I don't know, fiduciary responsibility, it would seem, right? So I think this is the place. If you want to, if I was going to summarize, right, because we don't have a ton of time, the one place that I think it would be hugely valuable for the U.S. government to get involved is to, for example, actually demand, and I still am amazed that I'm saying this, actually demand that these Chinese companies that are kind of on American exchanges actually be audited properly and assessed. And that would probably solve a lot of the problem of having these companies be part of indices and passively investing American money, the hard-earned money of Americans into, basically all of these technologies that we've been describing that are, sort of aimed at us from the Chinese side. So, this is a big topic. We could talk about it quite a bit, but I would say that's the area that I would be most interested in.
Unquestionably, it's a key focal point of any effort along these lines. I would just say he's not with us today, of course, but has on a couple of occasions Trevor Loudon has expounded on this idea that we ought to treat the Chinese Communist Party as what it is, a transnational criminal organization, and use techniques like we have used successfully against the mafia, for example, in this country, racketeering and related criminal statutes to essentially turn the participants in the mob activities against one another, to create an amnesty and essentially give people a certain time period in which to turn state's evidence. In the case of doing so, they get certain benefits, not prosecuted and so on. And those that don't, are driven out of the country or are, prosecuted. And his conviction, and I think it's probably right, is you'd see some very profound tectonic shifts in that establishment, I think, as you put it, that captured elite, which we need to see in this particular case of TikTok, but more generally as well. So let me just say to Sam Faddis and Grant Newsom, as well as John Wachowski, and to our friend Jan Mikelek, thank you for shedding some very, very illuminating light on this issue of TikTok. And Jan, particularly in your case, trying to help us understand where Donald Trump stands on the matter, and whether, in fact, the arguments that this is a national security risk of the first order still will operate, and that we will find ourselves, if it can be done. And this is a question that a number of people in our chat group have posed. Can it under any circumstances be done that the kind of weapon that the Chinese Communist Party has created in TikTok can be rendered essentially benign, even if it's wholly owned by an American company, given backdoors that might be baked into the system, or otherwise the vestiges of Chinese influence could be operated in. I just want to say I'm very grateful, because I personally subscribe, as I think most of our speakers have done, to the idea that this is a dagger pointed at the heart of the United States, its people, its military, its constitutional form of government. And anything that has 173 million subscribers hooked up to it, and that it is in the hands of the enemy, is obviously a mortal peril, and it has to be remedied. So we'll be following closely what Donald Trump and others do in the days ahead, and we'll be keeping you apprised as to how this fits into the larger portrait that we're painting of a Chinese Communist Party bent on our destruction through unrestricted warfare, among other techniques, often aided and abetted by captured American elites. With that, let me just say thank you. God bless you all. We appreciate your attendance weekly. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe at Present Danger China so that you don't miss any of these events. PresentDangerChina.org is the website. Back to you, Didi Logison. Thank you for your help in Oleg Atashins and both putting these programs on and making them available to a wider audience. God bless.
Thanks, Frank. And thanks to all of you for being here. A video of this webinar, as Frank said, will be posted to PresentDangerChina.org within a day or so of the conclusion of our program. It's at the same link where the registration was. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. And subscribe to our Substack at Present Danger China. Follow us on X at CPD China for updates. And join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how the CCP captured elites betray the USA. Thanks for joining us today, and goodbye.